Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
How do you see India dealing with this challenge in the immediate future, the second winter after the Chinese intrusion?
Jyoti, I have really little worry about what is going to happen this winter. I think the Indian Army has stayed through one winter last year, and that was much more challenging because you had so many troops that had come in, the infrastructure was not as good. This year is going to be much easier to build and to stay there.
The situation in eastern Ladakh and the way it has changed on the frontiers with China, there can be no going back to business as usual in India-China relations. The relationship has deteriorated over the past year and a half, and I'm afraid it is going to continue to deteriorate in the coming months and in the coming years.
I'm with General Deependra Singh, retired from the Indian Army, former Northern Army commander in charge of the surgical strikes across the line of control into Pakistan in 2016, and Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, former ambassador to China from 2017 to 18, and before that, India's High Commissioner to Pakistan. Gentlemen, welcome to the Print Debates.
Thank you.
So today we're talking about the field talks between India and China. The corps commanders have met for the 13th time on Sunday afternoon in Chushul, Moldo, on the line of actual control in the Ladakh sector. General Hooda, your first comments on this area. Why, you know this area well, why do you think the talks have broken down?
So I'm surprised, Jyoti. I frankly, after what had transpired in the last talks, and there was talk that we'll be able to resolve both the area of Gogra and Hot Spring, and Gogra did get resolved. So I frankly was hopeful that this area of Hot Spring PP15 would get settled this time, because frankly there is not too much difference as far as perceptions of LAC etc. go in this area. It's also not a strategically very significant area like, say, Demchok or Depsang. Why has it failed? I don't know. Jyoti, do we see the run-up to these corps commander level talks, and we find a certain level of provocation coming from China, one in Barahoti, and then just a few days before in the area of Tawang sector. Now, Tawang sector has had incursions in the past, but for China to do it at that scale just a few days before the corps commander level talks, I mean, does that indicate that the positions had hardened on both sides? I frankly don't have any inside knowledge of how the talks went, but as I said, I'm a little surprised.
Right. Ambassador Bambawale, you know China well, you speak Mandarin fluently, you've served there a few times. What is your perception? Why do you think the talks have failed?
Well, first of all, Jyoti, I would not say that the talks have failed, because I do not view it as an event to event or an episode to episode, a talk to talk kind of thing. Okay. I would look at a broader perspective, a broader time period, and I would take a look at all 13 rounds of talks. And if you do that, you will see that, the talks have been fairly successful in getting India's interests to be met. I would also say that, right from the time of April 2020 or even early May 2020, when the Chinese first committed the military aggression that they have done in eastern Ladakh, we knew that they hadn't done this without having thought it through. And therefore, I would say that we need to take steps.
Well, what does that mean, though, Ambassador Bambawale, when you say that you knew that they hadn't that they did this and they had thought it through? What does that mean?
Well, it means that it was not a sort of accidental patrols coming into contact with each other kind of situation, which had happened in 2013 in Depsang and possibly 2014 in Chumar. This, when you move large numbers of troops with heavy artillery, with tanks, etc. It's something which is planned, it is something which is well thought out, and then it has to be executed. So I think when you look at it from that perspective, this is a different kind of situation that India is facing. It is facing an aggressive China. It is facing a China which is trying to show that it is one of the biggest powers in the world, and it is a China which is trying to implement unipolarity in Asia. So this is a different kind of situation we're facing. And I've said this from day one, Jyoti, and I repeat that again today on your show.
Okay. General Hooda, explain to me when you say that PP15 or patrolling point 15, which is in the hot springs area in the Ladakh sector. Now, explain to our audience what the significance of that is. You said that it was not such a big deal, that the Chinese could have come around in the, especially if you look at an improving India-China relationship. So why do you think that the Chinese did not agree this time around? Explain that to us.
So, Jyoti, I'm saying this, PP15 is not such a strategically important area based on past experiences. We did have an incident in this area in 2015, if I recall. And at that time, the Chinese accepted that they had transgressed across and quietly went back. Also, as I said, if you look at it, if you look at the ground situation and look at the tactical importance of this area, it isn't that important. I mean, you really...
so why are they insisting on staying today?
So I think as Ambassador Gautam is trying to explain, I mean, this is the larger sort of picture that they're trying to impose, try and pressurize India, impose their will on India, an attempt to show that, we are the bigger power in Asia and that, India must accept this. So that is the reason. I don't see, as I said, any strategic importance to staying there. It's just an attempt to pressurize India and say, I also think, Jyoti, with all the infrastructure development that has taken place on both sides, but particularly on the Chinese side, maybe they feel they're a little more comfortable as far as holding on to these areas where they've come in is concerned, that they can logistically sustain themselves maybe through another winter.
Okay.
So there is no pressure even on that front that they need to sort of have an agreement and go back. And
right.
So therefore they are hardening their position. I mean, that's quite clear.
So Ambassador Bambawale, does this mean that the Chinese are testing you?
Yes, of course, the Chinese are testing us because, Jyoti, you have to keep in mind that if there are certain patrolling routes that we are no longer able to go on or patrol on, and there are certain patrolling points, and you spoke of PP15, which we are not able to reach and which we had reached in the past, which we used to reach and patrol every year, then it implies that they have changed the status quo. The Chinese have changed the status quo. And changing the status quo is military aggression as far as India and China relations are concerned, because many of the agreements which were reached between India and China, which were aimed at maintaining peace and tranquility in the border areas between our two countries, said in their first paragraph or in their first article that neither country will move large numbers of troops or large amount of equipment without notifying the other side. Mm-hmm. Now, the Chinese did not notify us in April 2020, and therefore they have violated those agreements and committed aggression, and they are definitely testing us. But I believe that they're testing us also in this broader and larger competition which today exists between the number one power in the world and what we can describe as the number two power in the world. So it's part of this bigger plan, strategy.
You're talking about the US and China.
I'm talking of the US and China.
Yeah. So, but hold your thought, Ambassador. I just want to ask you, General Hooda, this PP15 area, reports are that the Chinese want to create a buffer zone, just like we saw in the Pangong Tso area, when the Chinese moved back from Finger 4 to Finger 8, which is something of that the Indians were quite happy about. But in this particular area, do the Chinese want to create a buffer zone that's inwards into the line of actual control, into Indian territory? And the second question I have is that there are also reports that by staying on in this PP15 area, they're already inside Indian territory, which is south of the 1959 claim line. Is that correct? Yeah.
So, Jyoti, on the first question of buffer zones, I think it's not a bad arrangement. So what we have said in the past, and when we had these agreements, was that we are setting up these temporary buffer zones, which means you are separating out, armies, and so you're preventing any sort of clash that could happen when troops are in close contact. So you're creating the buffer zones, and in these buffer zones, both while India cannot patrol, so do Chinese cannot patrol.
But the
So
buffer
it's not
zones
as if.
are inside your territory, aren't they?
So let's take the example, Jyoti, of finger 4 and finger 8. So we claim areas up to finger 8 and the Chinese claim areas up to finger 4.
Right.
So while we say we cannot go beyond finger 4 and therefore we are restricted to our own side, it's the same situation for the Chinese. They claim areas up to finger 4 where they cannot access. So I think, this argument that it's only a one-sided buffer zone, I don't think, that really is true. And it helps, as I said, separate out troops. Helps get some forward movement in a place where you're deadlocked now on negotiation. At least there is some forward movement happening.
You yourself have patrolled up to PP15. So now, if there is a buffer zone, people like you and Indian troops will not be able to go there, right?
That is true. That is true. We are not going to be able to go. But similarly, the Chinese are not going to be able to come up to those areas which they are claiming. So where they are sitting today, they will have to vacate those areas.
Okay.
So as I said, Jyoti, I think it would be wrong to look at it as a completely one-sided disadvantage only to India and not to China.
Right. Ambassador Bambawale, can I ask you to pick up on the thought earlier about the US and China? This is the big picture that you're talking about. What is it?
Well, the big picture, Jyoti, is obviously that there is a strategic competition which is on. It is on between existing superpower or major power and a rising power. And obviously the rising power is challenging the existing power, particularly in Asia, or you can call it the Indo-Pacific if you want. This is the area of contention. And the reason for that is that if China has to replace, in the long run, the United States as the preeminent power in the globe or in the world, it has to ensure that it has complete hegemony over its own backyard and its own region, which is Asia. And that is what China is trying to do right now. She's being very aggressive, not just with India and on the India-China border. She's being aggressive with neighbors all across Asia. She's being aggressive with Taiwan and in the Taiwan Straits. She's been aggressive with the Southeast Asians and the South China Sea. She's being aggressive with Japan in the Senkaku Islands. And she has attempted economic coercion even with Australia. So you can see this jostling for change and power taking place even as we speak. And this is nothing but a rising power trying to claim complete hegemony over its backyard, which is Asia. And that is why the Chinese keep asking for multipolarity at a global level, but are aiming for unipolarity at a regional level.
So then would you agree with General Hooda? He seems quite sanguine about the fact that there can be a buffer zone around the patrolling points, PP15. Are you as sanguine as him? Do you think that it's okay to do that?
Look, Jyoti, I won't go into all because I'm looking at it from a much bigger and broader picture.
Yeah, but I do want to understand. Right.
With General Hooda, you use the word, but they are in our territory. Our territory, we claim the whole of Aksai Chin as our territory. So they are well within our territory. They have been for several decades, if you look at it from that point of view. And therefore, I'm a little hesitant to use terms as their territory, our territory. It still has to be defined because a boundary between the two countries still has to be arrived at through discussions. We had hoped it would happen through discussions and negotiations. Now it appears that the Chinese want to do it through the use of force.
Yes, but there are some things that are still not clear to lay people like us. Yes, Aksai Chin, you claim the map of India has the year of Aksai Chin, but it's been decades since any Indian walked on the ground of Aksai Chin. Is that correct? Now, General Hooda himself, General, you have patrolled up to PP15. But now you're saying it's okay not to do that. So there is a change in the ground in the last 4 or 5 years.
Of course, Jyoti, there is a change in the ground. I mean,
Are you
everybody.
okay with that? Are you okay with it?
See, I think that the point I'm making is that you have a situation today where the Chinese have ingressed in numerous areas. I'm saying so you're looking for some kind of arrangement by which they vacate those areas. Now, obviously, it's not a one-sided process. And if we think the Chinese are just going to go back after all that they've done in the past 1 year, that they will quietly go back and say, okay, status quo can be restored. I'm afraid, Jyoti, status quo is not going to be restored. So I'm only saying, if you are looking at finding some resolution to the current problem, then what is that resolution? And to me personally, this idea of buffer zones, I think for a resolution to the current crisis is not a bad option, is what I'm saying. So I'm not saying it's good or bad whether we are not able to go to PP15. I'm saying when you're looking for a resolution, how do you achieve that resolution?
Yeah, can I ask you, General, some months ago, India climbed the Kailash range, and with that, you achieved some sort of leverage. Now, subsequently, in an earlier round of Corps Commander talks, you came down the Kailash range. Did you lose leverage?
Yes, we did. Jyoti, so there are two viewpoints to our vacation of the Kailash range. One viewpoint is that if we hadn't vacated, we wouldn't have got any sort of agreement on the north bank of Pangong, so in Finger 4, Finger 8 area.
Right.
The other viewpoint, and I completely accept that viewpoint, is that by losing that leverage, we made our subsequent negotiations very difficult. Because if we had kept that leverage, perhaps it would have been easier to get a resolution of places like, Hot Springs, Gogra, perhaps even Dep Sound. But that was a decision, I think, taken by the leadership at that time. Good or bad, I think we can look at it in hindsight and say, perhaps we should not have vacated that. Perhaps we should have not have lost that leverage.
No, fair enough. Ambassador Bambawale, political leaderships make all kinds of decisions on the moment. You have lots of inputs coming in. I mean, I imagine that you guys have done the same. And while we can say in retrospect whether they should have or they shouldn't have, but the point is that by vacating the Kailash range, can you get back up there, or can you do something else to regain leverage? Because it seems to me that with the 13th round of the Corps Commander talks breaking down, India doesn't have that kind of leverage that it had earlier.
No, I take your point, and I totally accept that, we may have given up leverage. It is for the people who are in the decision-making seats to decide whether it's a leverage for one subsector, one sector, or whether it should be used for the entire area of Eastern Ladakh. That is for the people who are on the ground, who are on the spot to decide.
Right.
Also, one comment about PP15, the fact that we're not able to patrol up till there. We did that in the past. Let me say very clearly that even if we are not able to patrol today up to PP15, it doesn't mean that we're accepting that the boundary lies there at PP15. That is something which has to be negotiated between the two countries. And therefore, while we may have the status quo on the ground may have changed as a result of that, it doesn't mean that we have accepted that PP15 is where the line of actual control lies.
But Ambassador, you've been trying to negotiate with the Chinese on the boundary dispute for several decades. You haven't even been able to exchange maps except in the middle sector, where the Malhotra incident just took place a couple of weeks ago. So you can say what you like, really, but the Chinese are not willing to engage with you.
No, the Chinese are not willing to. And obviously, by what they have done since April 2020, they're clearly indicating that they want to settle this issue through the use of force or the use of arms, if you want. And they're turning their back on the discussion method, the discussion route, the negotiation way of going ahead. But this is a long-term game, Jyoti, and that is exactly what we have to play. And, in the book that we were referring to earlier, this is exactly the point that a group of us make, that in this long-term game, India has to strengthen itself internally, domestically, through economic growth and development, and through strategic patience on the boundary. So it's a long-term game which we are continuing to play, and we will play.
In this long-term game that Ambassador Bambawale refers to, General Hooda, can I ask you, in 1986, when the Sundarong Chu or the Wangdung incident took place, the face-off, at the time General Sundarji was army chief, and then he sort of airlifted troops, and there was a face-off with the Chinese. Now, the question is that it took 9 long years for that to be resolved. But isn't there a big difference between 1986 and 2021? I mean, it's like zameen aur asman ka farak hai India-China ke beech.
Yeah, Jyoti, so I completely agree with you. I also don't sort of like this comparison between Wangdong 86 and what is happening today. The conditions were completely different. I mean, if you look at India's military capability at that time, India's defense budget was higher than the Chinese defense budget. The economic difference between the two countries was not as large as it is today. The other major point is, by the actions that India did, it actually led to a period of rapprochement. You had Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visiting, you had these agreements that all got sort of put into place. So I think comparing that period and today is not right. I completely agree with Ambassador Gautam that, we need to take a long-term look at this. It doesn't matter, whether PP15 gets resolved today or tomorrow, or there is, in whose favor. What is our long-term plan to deal with the rising, aggressive and assertive China in future? A China that is growing economically much more powerful. China where the military capability of the two sides, India and China, is going to constantly turn in China's favor. Again, as Gautam pointed out, a country that wants to establish its hegemony in Asia as a step to becoming a great power. Mm-hmm. So these are issues I think that we should be looking at and seeing how we can build up that kind of capability that can deter China from attempting to use military force to pressurize us along the border.
So, Ambassador Bambawale, this book that you and your colleagues have written, can you show us? Perhaps if you can show it to us, it's called Rising
to the China Challenge: Winning through Strategic Patience and Economic Growth.
Now, if you had very strong words to describe the military intrusions. You said it's military aggression. But how do you counter this? I mean, some ideas perhaps that you may have to, how does India rise to the China challenge?
Yeah, thank you, Jyoti. First of all, let me start by saying that I believe that the Indian military response has been magnificent. We have actually, in my opinion, and you could disagree with me, we have actually ensured with our military response that the Chinese have not been able to achieve all their strategic goals or all their goals when they set out to do this in April 2020.
In what way? In what way? What have they not been able to do?
I don't think they have been able to reach the points where they may have perhaps wanted to reach through their military aggression, the points on the ground. So that's point number one. But as you were asking me, in the longer run, India needs to turn inward. India needs to, one of the necessary conditions which obtained when China committed this military aggression in April 2020 was the huge asymmetry in economic and other power between comprehensive national power, if you like to put it that way, between our two countries, between China and India. And in the long run, over the next 20, 25 years, we must decrease that asymmetry, reduce that asymmetry. The only way to do it is to ensure that we grow, our GDP grows by 8, 9, 10% per annum over the next 20, 25 years. But in the short run, what do we have to do? In the short run, I'm afraid that we will have to build balancing coalitions with other countries, other groups of countries. It need not be one coalition, it could be different coalitions to balance China. And the Quad is one example of such a balancing coalition. So I am a strong proponent, and I'm not using the word alliance because we in India have some sort of We don't like this word alliance. We like to stick to our idea of having independent action, etc., and strategic autonomy. So I'm not using the word alliance. I'm using the word building a balancing coalition with other countries, and the Quad is one such example.
But you think we should build an alliance?
If we are not able to achieve the kind of economic growth which we are proposing in our book of 8 or 9% per annum GDP growth over 20-25 years, then in order to ensure India's independence, ensure India's territorial integrity, I'm afraid there will be nothing else to do but to build alliances.
With the Quad nations like the US, Japan, and Australia in this particular case?
I won't go into individual countries, Jyoti. Okay. I'll leave that at a more holistic level.
Yeah. General Hooda, can I ask you about you supervised, if you like, the surgical strikes with Pakistan in 2016. Now, the China and Pakistan have a really close relationship between iron brothers, as they describe themselves. So if this long-term view that you and Ambassador Bambawale are advocating, how do you see this with Pakistan and India? We don't have a good relationship at all. So how do you see this China and Pakistan tie affecting India's strategic autonomy?
No. So, it's a well-known fact that relations between Pakistan and China are close, and that they could, in some contingencies, also sort of align with each other during operations or during conflict. I think we have to be quite clear about that capability. Now, I know there used to be a lot of talk about this two-front challenge is something that the Indian military is sort of overplaying, and that it is not going to happen, and they're doing it only because they want greater resources, etc. I think what has happened now with China since last year is that the two-front threat kind of has become fairly sort of real. And so we have to build our capabilities for that, Jyoti. How it is going to be done, what is the kind of resources that are required? I'm sure these are questions that are going to be occupying both military and political leaders' minds. I also want to just add to what Ambassador Gautam said about alliances. If you look 10, 15, 20 years into the future, tell me one country that can stand on its own against an assertive China. One country in Asia. So you have to build, whether you call it coalitions, whether you call it alliances, you have to get together to be able to challenge China. Mm-hmm. By itself, a single country in the next 20 years is not going to be able to stand up to that challenge. So I know all this talk about strategic autonomy and all is very good, but I think we have to be realists in seeing how geopolitics in the future is going to play out.
But Ambassador Bambawale, are you not concerned about the G2, the term that came into fairly frequent currency in the previous Democratic administration, the Barack Obama administration? And he himself talked about how the 21st century is going to be shaped by the US and China. Perhaps the Americans have changed as well in these last 10 years. But are you concerned that, you may ally or coalesce or, use whatever word you want, but come closer with the US in perhaps sort of containing China, but that the Americans may shift sides?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Jyoti. But if you permit me, I would like to answer through the use of, through an academic international affairs perspective, and which is, I don't know if you've heard of structural realism, of which Professor John Mearsheimer is the foremost living proponent at the University of Chicago. There were others before him, of course. But structural realism says, and I believe, and I agree with it, that both the US and China will just try to accumulate more and more power. I do not think that the US, especially today, is going to accept China as a peer competitor. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican in the United States, China policy, there is great agreement that we will not tolerate China as a peer competitor. We will stop China in its tracks as a rising power. And according to this theory of international relations, there is no way that there can be a G2 between these two countries. And I totally accept that and agree with that. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that other powers in Asia, like Japan, Australia, India, even ASEAN, will slowly be forced to take sides. Today, many of us are saying we do not want to take sides between these two competitors. But we will be forced to take sides because China is right on our doorsteps. The US is thousands of miles away. We have similar values with the United States. And therefore, this very structure of international politics and international affairs is moving India to coalesce or form a coalition with the United States, maybe even form an alliance.
Right. I'm going to ask you to hold your thought. Last couple of questions. General Hooda, can I bring you back to the two-front war between China that India could perhaps fight alongside with China and, okay, let me say this again. General Hooda, can I bring you back to the two-front war that you talked about, which you said, the prospect of which you said is quite real, with China and Pakistan at the same time. Do you think that in the Ladakh area, the Chinese could sort of intersect and in the Karakoram range, and perhaps could also sort of territory could merge in that area?
Yes, Jyoti. So if you actually look at the map of India, the only place where there are contiguous borders with Pakistan and with China, that area is Ladakh. So on the west, you have the Kargil sector, the Siachen glacier area. And on the east, you have the line of actual control. So if you're looking at areas where India can get pressurized from both fronts, the area is Ladakh. Having said that, it's not going to be also completely easy, Jyoti, because the terrain is extremely, extremely challenging. So for any link, for example, people talk about, the Depsang Plains and the Siachen. Mm-hmm. For any link between these two areas, you actually have to cross the Karakoram range. And that is enormously, enormously difficult. But in Ladakh, frankly, the threat remains. And if you ask me as a Northern Army commander, what was my greatest concern? My greatest concern was Ladakh. The other problem with Ladakh is that it remains cut off for 5 to 6 months in a year from the rest of the country. Mm. And on the Tibetan plateau, there is not so much precipitation. So even in winters, operations are feasible. So Ladakh is cut off from the rest of the country. And you see, if you look at the Chinese exercises, for example, they've been exercising in the months of in the months of January, February, etc. So as far as threat is concerned and a two-front challenge is concerned, I think Ladakh is one area that we need to carefully look at.
So going forward then, General, and the last question, how do you see India dealing with this challenge in the immediate future as winter comes up, the second winter after the Chinese intrusion?
Jyoti, I have really little worry about what is going to happen this winter. I think the Indian Army has stayed through one winter last year, and that was much more challenging. Because you had so many troops that had come in, the infrastructure was not as good. This year is going to be much easier to build and to stay there. So I find no real concerns about whether the Indian Army is going to be able to stay there through the winters or whether it will be able to carry out its operation. I think we have to start looking long-term, Jyoti. We have to look at how do we build up long-term capability against China. We believed in the past that our military capability, our deployment along the border has sufficient deterrence against Chinese military capability. What we are seeing now is that deterrence has got weakened, which is why you find China, has used military force to try and come inside in areas like Ladakh. And if that deterrence has weakened, then how do we reestablish that deterrence over a long term is something that we should be looking at.
So last question to you, Ambassador Bambawale. I was rifling through the Chinese media and of course in English because I don't read Mandarin. But some of the reports that you find in the PLA, in the military newspapers, is that they do not take India as a military threat. They did not take it seriously.
No, that's quite possible because, as we were just listening to General Hooda, that basically we have a defensive posture where China is concerned, for that matter, even where Pakistan is concerned. And it's possible that because of that, that the Chinese do not look upon us as a military threat. But definitely we should be able to protect and defend ourselves. And in order to do that, we need to, think long term and need to think very deeply and introspect as to what India should be doing rather than what China is doing.
Right.
Also, let me just add and finish there that with the situation in Eastern Ladakh and the way it has changed on the frontiers with China, there can be no going back to business as usual in India-China relations. The relationship has deteriorated over the past year and a half, and I'm afraid it is going to continue to deteriorate in the coming months and in the coming years.
Well, I suppose for the first thing that India has to do is to come to confront the fact that the situation has deteriorated, not just in Ladakh, but across the board. But gentlemen, General Hooda and Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, thank you so much for joining the Print debate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti.